getting rid of the stress without the pregame show. We choose the stress. Click.
It's not that stressful.
And we're live. It is Wednesday, June 2nd, 2021, 5:01 p.m. It is the 432nd episode of In Lieu of Fun. And who better to represent the number 432 for us than Mr. Charlie Sykes, joining us from Wisconsin, which I took a train through without stopping not 36 hours ago. Kate announced as we were getting ready to go through the show in a fashion that gives rise to a perfect monologue, which we're about to hear. She said, I have a cut on my nose and it comes from a volcano. And that is the first line of a monologue if I've ever heard one. So Kate, the floor is yours.
Oh, yeah. So as everyone knows, I was in Iceland for a while, and there is an actively erupting volcano. I was told by a local that it is what is called a good for tourism volcano because it is this just hot erupting. It erupts every 4 to 6 minutes with just like a almost cinematic geyser of lava bubbling out, and then just like a river, like a literal river of lava, straight from the depths of hell, just kind of is moving along, and magma is moving along on either side of you as you stand on this mountain to look at this volcano. And it was lovely, except it was 60 to 70 mile per hour winds. I think you'll remember this, Ben. I think I texted you and Scott and was like, we have run into some very high winds and things are really crazy right now. And everything is taking longer to do than I thought it was going to, because we're hiking against a 70 mile. So I was the bear crawl, and you're on the floor with your butt up in the air and you're we were doing that across the surface of this trail, because I was freaking out that I was going to blow away like a balloon or something. But anyway, yeah, I know. But the other thing that was happening simultaneously, which was quite intense, was that there's all of this so the thing that I was holding up before, this piece of cooled magma that I took off from the river of magma for Ben, and you could kind of see this because I thought Ben would think it's cool. I was at the site, and there are all these other people around. I was like, fresh earth rocks, get your fresh earth rocks right here. And but anyways, this thing is sharp. Okay, it is really, really, really sharp. And so were all of the little pebbles and gravel, and they're also very light because they're filled with air. So the other side of this is you can see it's it's a typical pumice type volcanic reaction. But anyways, it was super sharp. And the thing with the wind was that I was holding my hands over my face, and the wind was just whipping this kind of pumicey gravel against my face. And a huge chunk hit me right in the bridge of my nose. And I didn't realize that it had cut it until I got home and saw a little bit of blood, and it was kind of cut. And I was like, well, that's badass. I got a cut.
But it's a great story.
I got assaulted by a volcano.
Yeah, I just took a shower, and now it reopened, and I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't realize it until I was looking on camera, and I was like, oh, I have a cut on my nose again, and I was like, oh, it's the same cut. Anyways, and that's how I got beat up by a volcano.
All right.
So this could be a tourism video for Iceland, right?
I've been
come to our tourist-friendly hellscape.
We will cut your face.
Yeah, right.
Which is yet one more way of saying that we are not allowed to have fun anymore. Because even when you go to a volcano, expecting the tourist-friendly version, it whips gravel in your face and you get cut. And then you get stuck in Iceland because you don't have a PCR test to get out. And you have to birth lambs. It's a rough world out there, folks, but it is not as rough as the domestic Republican Party.
Oh, yeah, it's not anywhere near.
Charlie Sykes, who represents the kinder, gentler Republican Party of yore, which was not a cult of personality. And if you don't listen to the Bulwark Podcast every day, which is Charlie's chronicle of the decline and fall of conservatism and the Republican Party, and his ongoing struggle with what we do next. I highly recommend it. I used to say it was one of 2 podcasts I listen to every day, but since Slate has destroyed the gist of With Mike Pesca, it is now the only podcast I listen to every day. Charlie, welcome back to In Lieu of Fun.
Well, thank you. And the description of the hellscape seems like the perfect segue into our conversation.
It's a word that shows up on your podcast a lot.
Yes.
I want to start. So for those who do not listen to Charlie's podcast, it really has turned into a kind of ongoing rumination on how, which parts of the contemporary Republican Party are novelly bad, which parts were always bad, but people like Charlie didn't notice. And I want to commend Charlie and the Bulwark crew for actually grappling with that in a way that is ongoing and interesting, and which parts of it are a little bit more complicated than that. Like how should people engage with the Liz Cheneys of the world? So I want to ask you, and then there's another element of the podcast, which is it gives disproportionate attention to the state of Wisconsin, which it does both because Wisconsin is disproportionately important and because Charlie is a Wisconsinian, or Wisconsinite, and it has long roots in the Wisconsin Republican Party. And therefore, it's a kind of microcosm for you, I think, of everything that's going on nationally. So I want to ask kind of how you're feeling right now.
Well, first of all, Benjamin, thank you for using the word rumination, because that's a nice euphemism for we really don't know the answer to this, and I'm often confused in the answer to those questions. How did we get here? How did this happen? This long soul-crushing slog across the hellscape that's the Republican Party, and you're right. I find myself wrestling with it more all the time, and those of us who've been through it, we'll look at each other and go, okay, so were they always crazy? Did we not know this? Did something happen? Is there something in the water? How bad can this get? Is there any bottom? And so I guess part of the way I'm feeling is that in my mind I have been naive many times in the past. I'm willing to fess up to that, but I really thought that things might get better after Trump left office. That after he was defeated, after he was disgraced, that there would be a rise of sane people on the right, and in fact it's gotten worse. And so it's like, at the moment when I thought, okay, we're going to be looking back on that was pretty terrible, let's move on, we're now in the prospect of asking how much worse can it get. So if I was confused before, I would describe myself as even more confused and conflicted now.
And sorry, go ahead, Kate.
Well, I was just going to ask, so Sarah Longwell's been on a few times and I love her, and we've had some debates about kind of, and they especially happened after January 6th, about basically the possibility of a third party. And I guess I kind of want to raise it as not just a possibility of a third party, but more about it being the death of the two-party system, if that makes sense, that it's not necessarily a rise of something else so much as it is the two-party system becomes defunct in various ways. I just was kind of curious if you had, I know this is something you've talked about before, but I just wonder if the last couple of weeks have changed your mind about anything at all.
Well, I think it's very clear that we're not going to reform or fix the Republican Party anytime soon. So, those people who are issuing the declarations, we're going to give you Republicans one last chance, you need to fix yourself or we're out. It's like, what are you waiting for? How many red lines do you need to cross? So I think that's clear, that there's really no reformation of the Republican Party in any sort of near-term horizon. So then that raises the question. There are some people, and they write for the Bulwark, who want to become, what is it? The red dogs. They want to align them. They want to basically become Democrats. I'm not sure that's an option for a lot of conservatives at this point. Obviously there's going to be a need to make alliances in terms of voting in 2022 and 2024. But that does lead to this whole question of the third party. And I do think that this is a moment where I think people of goodwill need to come together to say that, we're not part of this duopoly. And I think it's important that it be run by people who are flexible. And by flexible, I mean support principled Republicans on occasion, support Democrats when you don't want to be a spoiler, and when there's no good option, be able to hoist the pirate flag of a third way.
So really quickly, sorry, Ben, your turn. Go ahead. Go. I just am curious about I think that's exactly right. And I also think that there is an incredible amount of power to be leveraged by people who come into that position, because you are in the same way that Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins right. use this, right? This is a classic way to or Sandra Day O'Connor, you're just kind of going to have all of this power as the middle, as the swing. And I think that, so I'm kind of curious why it just besides the fact that there are actual that there are structures in our actual system that imagine a two-party system, what else is holding us back from creating this?
Well, that's one of them. I mean,
right.
the institutionalization is so deeply ingrained.
It's so deep. Yep.
It's so it is very, very tough to break into that. But you just mentioned one thing that would be a really interesting development. What if you did have 3 or 4 Republicans join with 3 or 4 Democrats and say, okay, you know what? We're going to form an independent caucus. And that independent caucus does not become irrelevant. It becomes the power center. It doesn't, withdraw from it. And so you have the people, like Lisa Murkowski sitting down with, reasonable Democrats and saying, okay, this system isn't working. As an alternative to breaking the filibuster, which we can talk about a little bit later, how about we break the entire duopoly that we have here, the whole majority minority thing? And
that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that would be radical. But again, think about how few senators you would need to do that sort of thing. Also, can I just point out, underappreciated, in fact, you have at least, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, at least 3 members of the Senate who are not officially members of either the Democratic or Republican Party. I mean, Lisa Murkowski was elected as an independent, as a write-in. Bernie Sanders is an independent, even though he caucuses with Democrat. Angus King, those 3. So imagine if you had a handful of 5, 6, 7 Republicans join with a handful of Democrats. You could really, that would be the one thing that would change the toxicity of our politics, at least temporarily.
But it only works, I think, if they could agree to vote as a block,
mm-hmm,
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, and the problem is that, I think you got to leave Bernie Sanders out, because he wants to outflank the Democratic Party from the left. Yeah. And actually, Angus King is not a centrist by senatorial standards. But I think you could imagine Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, for example, joining with Murkowski and Collins and saying... And Romney. And saying nothing happens in this body without the 5 of us agreeing, and we're going to caucus as our own entity. Right. And it seems to me the thing that prevents that is a certain amount of party tribalism, that at the end of the day, Lisa Murkowski thinks of herself as a Republican and Joe Manchin thinks of himself as a Democrat. And though they agree on probably 85% of everything, and they're all kind of institutional conservatives, they do have different cloakrooms in which they hang their cloaks. Bad analogy. Yeah. And I'm wondering, and those cloakrooms have a lot to do with money. That is how they finance their campaigns.
Yes.
What do you do about that?
Well, again, none of this is easy. I mean, and anybody thinks it's going to happen. But let's go back to our formula where they create a caucus that becomes the power center and that organizes the United States Senate, which means that these five in a coalition government can change the committee structure, can change who is the chairman of the committees, the way in which bills are scheduled on the floor. Money flows to power inevitably. The people from K Street are going to deal with the person who is the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent centrist. The bigger problem with money, though, is the shift from so-called special interest corporate money, the big donor money, to now the beating heartbeat of fundraising are the grassroots folks. And it's changing our politics. It's why the Marjorie Taylor Greens are so prominent, because they know that they can be as crazy as possible and still raise lots of money. Same thing occurs on the Democrats. The question is whether or not a third party would have that kind of passionate grassroots base that would give them the $10, the $5, $10, $20 to fuel all of that. Because right now, the crazy is being subsidized by the grassroots in an absolutely just mind-blowing way.
So just for those who think this idea is completely crazy, I want to give you some news from Israel today, where
I was thinking about that.
The formation of a new Israeli government.
I've been wanting to ask you about this.
Is subject to a vote by the Shura Council of the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated Israeli party, which is called in Hebrew Ra'am, or in English the United Arab List. And the United Arab List existed for decades now, since the 70s, and recently declared that it was willing to enter into an Israeli government, and it was accepting bids. And both Netanyahu and the change bloc that is poised to replace him did exactly what Charlie is describing, just by saying we're willing, as moderate Islamists, to enter into an Israeli government. They became a power center, and everybody bid for their support. And now, assuming this government actually happens, it will have Islamist parliamentarians in it, and one of them will actually be in the government. And that they are doing exactly what Charlie describes, simply saying we're willing to do business. And all of a sudden they become a power center in Israeli politics. So I think what Charlie's describing is completely crazy. It's completely crazy until the moment that somebody does it.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think it's totally that crazy. Well, listen, have we not all been sitting?
The two-party
sitting
system
through the last
is
6
really
years?
well entrenched, but it's not more entrenched than the idea that Israeli Arabs don't sit in Israeli governments.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then the question is, electorally, how does it play out? And I could certainly see a moment where somebody is running for governor of the United States Senate who says, listen, these two major parties have failed. They've all doubled down on the crazy. And would you like somebody who is not beholden to either of the party structures? And I could see that being having some electoral appeal. However, when I say this, I think it's very important not to fall into the trap of, like the libertarians have fallen into, of becoming crazy or becoming just a spoiler party. You certainly do not want to be in a situation in 2024 where Donald Trump can get back in the White House because we have a third party that enables that to happen. I mean, if Trump wants to go off, or the Trumpists want to go off and create their own third party, that's fine. I don't think they're going to do that, since they already, own the Republican Party lock, stock, and barrel. What do they need?
Why would they bother?
Why would they bother?
But that's also the part about a lot of the caucuses right now, which is that they have some power because they're caucuses, because there's always power in a group. But they're not leveraging something that isn't going to already have like massive leverage right now in terms of what's coming before them. And so they're not on the edge. And I just really think that this actually sounds maybe it's unprecedented, but it doesn't actually even seem that totally unprecedented. It's not as if like there haven't been bipartisan support for things. It hasn't formalized itself into a caucus necessarily, but I just think that it would be like, I think it would also just be like a very smart move, because I think a lot of people want reasonable, rational decision makers that want things to get done. I mean, right now it's been years and years and years of nothing getting passed, nothing getting done. And people are sick of that. And if you were if you were Mitt Romney, if you were Manchin, if you were whatever, to say like, I think that's a powerful thing to go back to your constituency with.
Oh, I think so too. And so here's another crazy, totally impractical, observation as well, that okay, we are bitterly divided in our politics, right? We've never been this polarized or tribalized, except if you notice that we're also in this weird moment where we're not actually that divided on major public policy issues.
No, it's like abortion and guns.
Reasonable, right? Okay, abortion and guns are out here. But when it comes to things like child tax credits, the stimulus payments, infrastructure, it's kind of remarkable that the two parties are really, you can almost just sort of sense that you could draw a circle, a Venn diagram, and they're closer than ever before, since Republicans are not into fiscal conservatism anymore, and since they want to get things done. But you could have this sort of centrist moment, this third way moment that could actually begin to show that the democratic institutions can deliver. You could actually begin to legislate in a way that's less sort of, I don't know, just the lockstep rote way that we're doing it right now. And frankly, some of the senators might actually like it because more of them would become suddenly relevant. See, this is the thing that I really don't understand. You're a United States senator, and it's tied 50-50. Every one of you is a superpower. Why are so many of them so willing to surrender their power and their clout and become potted plants? Right? You become a United States senator, you can do anything you want, and you basically say, hey, here are all of my gonads, Mr. McConnell. Why don't you decide what I get to do for the next? I mean, really, what is that about?
And they do that about women's gonads too. So that's like, I want
to push you on this.
I thought that was gender neutral.
I want to push you on this question, though, of the dichotomy between the relative confluence of policy and intensity of tribalism. Obviously, one thing they're fighting over is Trump. But Trump is also a creature of the division. He's as much as he is a cause of the division. So why is it, do you think, that we are simultaneously so much more divided than ever before and fighting over less? I mean, surely a world in which, you had Ronald Reagan running against Walter Mondale, right? Very traditional liberalism versus a kind of energetic, muscular conservatism, right? That an ideology that actually believed in something. Surely that is a more divisive policy environment than a world in which Mitt Romney proposes one kind of child tax credit and, Joe Biden proposes another. What is it that we're really fighting over here other than the personality of Donald Trump?
Well, that's the key question. Why are we so divided? And I think in part because we're talking past each other, that we're not talking about policy. The Republicans didn't even have a platform last year. And you look at most of what's happening on the right, and it's not about these issues and these policies. It's all about the cultural stuff. It's all about the personality of Donald Trump, obviously. It's about race. It's about, sexual orientation. It's all about these hot button issues. And so you go into right-wing media and I feel like we're like two different universes. I think the Democrats are dealing with infrastructure and stimulus and these various policies. It's like they're the chess club. And they bring the chess club into the rave or something. I mean, there's this wild thing going on into the Thunderdome where they're talking about everything else, cancel culture. And And so it is very, very emotional. It is that sense that, that we are under siege, that we are victims. But it is a strange moment, and it is a paradox. And I don't know that I fully understand all of it. I agree, and I've said this many, many times, Donald Trump obviously is a symptom, not a cause. But increasingly since January 6th, he's also a cause. Because as loyalty to him becomes the litmus test, he continues to drive what the Republicans talk about and what they don't talk about. And it's not just loyalty to Trump. I think the Liz Cheney story is really significant because Liz Cheney is on a policy basis as conservative as anybody. She was loyal to Trump, and they threw her out, not because she was disloyal to Trump, but because she was disloyal on the big lie. So the definition of loyalty has been narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. So if this goes on for another couple of years, this will also derange the Republican Party beyond the extent that it is now, because last 4 years, let's be honest, I'm not defending them in any way, but at least they were talking about tax cuts. They were talking about deregulation. They had a policy or pretended policy about immigration. They talked about this. Now Trumpism is all about Trump and about backing up his conspiracy theories and his lies. So I don't know, at some point, where do you get the guys in the room to say, hey, by the way, while this is all going on, can we talk about how do we get children out of poverty? What can we do about job retraining? Is there something we can do with childcare in the country? I mean, it is a total split screen.
So I want to throw out a possible explanation for the split screen and get your reaction to it. Mm-hmm. So in the traditional Republican Party, there was always this populist strain, but there was a strata of responsible conservative politicians coached by, with their ears being whispered in by an elite kind of conservative intelligentsia, that actually successfully squelched this horde, I don't know what to call it, on a regular basis. And so it would show up in the Pat Buchanan campaign. Right. We all knew it was there, but at the end of the day, the Pat Buchanan campaign would get 38% of the vote and then get sent back to, below the ground. And what happened was, but what we didn't understand, or maybe didn't care to understand about the horde, is that they actually didn't care about policy. They only cared about owning the libs. They cared about these tribal aspects of government. And so now that they've taken over the party, along with Donald Trump, who cares only about fealty to Donald Trump, the policy issues get thrown to the side. And so optically, it looks like there's a degree of policy consensus because Republicans just don't talk about policy anymore. But actually, the Republican position is oppose everything no matter what it is, because that's what both the base wants for own the libs purposes and what Donald Trump wants for self-promotional purposes. And so the split screen is actually a bit of an optical illusion. What's really happening is the party doesn't talk about policy anymore.
Right. No, I think that's true, and this is this is the line that I've used in the past, which is that there was always the crazy populist wing, but that was the recessive gene on the right. That it was the Pat Buchanans, the white nationalists, the racist, and the center would always hold, and so that's really been the pattern. I mean, you look at say 2012, the Republican primaries, right? You had one crazy after another rose to the top. You had Michelle Bachmann, you had Newt Gingrich. but ultimately,
although Michelle Bachmann looked positively normal compared to the current.
No, she does not.
Party.
Just shut your mouth. That lady was nutso.
She was not. Well, I mean,
her.
This was a warning. It was like the fact that there were people out there who thought, "Hey, Michelle Bachmann is not crazy. Let's go with her." Okay, so, but what happened is that the Republican Party would always come back to the rational, reasonable choice, and you're right. The elites would whisper, and then that all broke down, and you know, one of my theories is really that the policy veneer, the influence of the intellectual elites was this thin crust on top of something much bigger and different, and with different motivations that we did not fully understand, that we did not really fully take into consideration how radical a change had taken place in what the conservative base was, that we're not talking about Republicans like Margaret Chase Smith anymore, that the shift of the party to a Southern base, to an evangelical base, to a more populist base, was going to have huge consequences. Because you think about the kinds of people that vote Republican now, completely different than the kinds of people that voted Republican back in the 1950s, and that has huge consequences. But it is the intellectual and the policy collapse of the party and the intellectual collapse of the party has been, it feels precipitous, but maybe that was always the Potemkin village. You know, maybe this was, or at least a Potemkin village since the 1960s, because there are changes. But it is hard to grasp how radicalized this party is, and the disconcerting part is that 70% of Republicans believe anything Donald Trump says. What is it? 70% believe that the election was fake. I mean, this is a party that's not. It's not a conservative party. This is a party that has become increasingly isolated from reality, and as you point out, Benjamin, just doesn't really seem to care about policy as opposed to identity and attitude and posture. As long as you're the bully on the playground and you're punching some dweeby liberal, then hey, that's it. That's what we're about.
So I want to get back to something we were kind of talking about before, which was we briefly mentioned, and the New York Times had a story about today, which I thought was quite interesting, which is about how the stimulus checks have basically been turns out to have been absolutely life-saving kind of in the pandemic, and for everyone who got them, but then especially people who got extra aid from the government to feed their families when there was some food scarcity and other things. And this was just super important. Annie Lowrey, who we should have on, by the way, wrote a really excellent book called I think it was just called Give Them Money, which was just which was basically this a proponent of this type of Jason Furman kind of economic policy of give them money and then let it move around and keep taking away friction and keeping the economy and the market moving. And I'm really curious because in my mind, Charlie, the Republican Party of my parents, the Rockefeller Republicans, as they like to call themselves, were it was exactly what you said. It's a small government, open, kind of more progressive social policies. And now those things are starting to fold together. Giving people money seems to be a very easy, direct way of helping people. And it is also espoused by the more most of the most of the left and most of the right. I think, that was, everyone likes to tell their constituencies they're putting money in their pocket. So I'm really curious, whether this is a new future, and what you think of that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a new future for Republicans because it's too deeply ingrained that you're giving other people money. You're giving my money to other people, redistribution. I think there's going to be a lot of resentment. Now, keep in mind that I am the author of a book called A Nation of Moochers, which talks about, the culture of getting something for nothing. Now, in my defense, about half that book is about corporate welfare and about how everybody is lined up at the trough to get, other people's money. So I come from a tradition where this idea of just spreading around money is the definition of bad public policy. Now, again, I'm willing to rethink all of this, because the one thing that I think is interesting about the just setting out the money is that it is so much less prescriptive than the kinds of punitive policies that I think the right had become enamored with, which was, let's make it as difficult as possible. Let's attach stigmas. Let's attach micromanagement to the decisions you make in your life, which is really the opposite of small government libertarian approach, as opposed to saying, we're going to trust you with this money, as opposed to saying, we will give you the money, in only these particular cases. And I will tell you, see, here's one conversation that kind of haunts me. And I remember this is pre-Trump, back when I was a conservative in good standing before the excommunication. And I was at a meeting with, I suppose I could mention, some of the big leaders in the party, including the head of the state's biggest business organization, the industry group, which was incredibly influential in the Republican Party. And we're talking about a variety of policies. And I said, somebody asked me a hard question the other day. What policies do Republicans favor that would actually increase middle class wages or improve the condition of the middle class? These are my dogs.
Doggo!
This usually doesn't happen, at least on TV. I'm hoping it means that my wife just arrived home and will open the door.
We love doggos.
Dogs.
Okay, so the answer,
You're fine.
His answer was, I'd never actually thought about that. He had no answer. In fact, he not only didn't have an answer, it was like, nobody's really ever asked me that before, because our entire agenda is cutting taxes on business and punishing people who are, say, unemployed. So you'll notice that one of the big initiatives around the country is, how do you deal with unemployment? Or the problem of getting people back to work. Let's actually be more punitive. Let's take away the aid. And this has become the right's sort of go-to thing. And I wonder whether or not there is an actual more populist conservatism that says, hey, maybe we ought to pursue policies that actually make your life better, that actually open doors. And unfortunately, they've been locked into, and I think, Benjamin, you made reference to this before, which I don't want to gloss over, they're locked into being against anything that any Democrat proposes. Yeah. So this is part of the problem, is that when you are opposed to anything that any Democrat has ever proposed, you're not going to be open to some of those policies that I actually think could be adopted by a new kind of Republican Party. But they won't.
We have to go to Hillary, but I wanted to say that the best, I love that story. But I want to say the best thing that you said in that entire answer, I thought, was I'm open to rethinking this idea, which I think is just the most wonderful kind of, I wish, I just why can't we all of our held beliefs, update our priors as new information surfaces and we go through life, and it shows that X solution is not the solution and Y solution is the solution. So anyways, that being said, we have to go to Reverend Dr. Hillary Livingston. You presume correctly. Hello.
Hi, how's everybody doing?
Good. How are you? Thanks for the sign. I love it.
Oh, I remembered to change my letterboard.
It's super cute.
Thank you. So thank you, Charlie, for talking with us today. I'm a big fan of the Bulwark, so appreciate all you guys do. My question, you touched on it earlier, but you talked about in your newsletter today about the formation of an alliance of welcoming Democrats and pro-democracy ex-Republicans. You talked a little bit about what a power center could look like. How realistic do you think that really is? And what would it actually take to do that, to make it effective? And what can average people like myself do to possibly help with some of this?
Well, okay, I start off by saying that it's a crazy, I agree with Benjamin, that it's a crazy idea until it actually happens, that I certainly wouldn't deny there's a little bit of tilting of windmills aspect to it. But what it's going to take, I think, is just incredible frustration of the failure of the two parties to get anything done. And I think that we might see that train wreck relatively soon. I'm trying to imagine what it would be like if if Republicans do take control of Congress in the 2022 elections, because they won't be looking to compromise or to make government work better or to, keep the, trains running on time. They will try to obstruct the Biden administration in any way whatsoever. And sort of imagine Ted Cruz shutting down the government with no exit strategy on steroids. So will that generate a reaction from people saying, I'm just sick of this. I'm just tired of this. This is wrong. To your point about what do average people do about it, this is where I think, and I'm somewhat skeptical of these third ways. I mean, some of the groups that have come up, the statement issued by 150 former Republicans, calling for some renewal. I have a mild dissent that they are holding out too much hope for Republicans. But I think that there are more and more grassroots movements of people who are saying, hey, maybe we'll step out of this duopoly. So keep an eye out for them. Don't put your faith in princes. Don't assume that it's going to change anything. We may need to make much tougher alliances in the near term before we go off in our different way. But at some point there's always a breaking point. Either people become exhausted or they become disgusted and determined to do something about it. I don't know which was going to happen.
Mr. Ducks with Pants, E.G. Phillips, the floor is yours.
Hey, Charlie, how you doing? I enjoy the Bulwark. I'm doing all right. I enjoy the Bulwark quite a bit. So on this figure you cited of the number of Republicans who believe the election was stolen, that raises a question in my mind of what percentage of those do we think are the true believers who absolutely believe that's the case, and to what degree are there a certain group of people who that's sort of performative, that they're pissed off that they lost the election. It feels good to say that it was stolen, and it pisses off the right people like the Never Trumpers and the libs to say so. And then maybe there's sort of an overcount in terms of the number of the amount of crazy out there. Just like people might avoid answering pollsters, whether they support Trump or not. Maybe they're more inclined to tell pollsters, hey, I believe the election is stolen. It may be a distinction without a difference to a certain degree in terms of a dollar given out of passion and versus a dollar given out for the laws. But maybe it's also just a sign. Maybe things aren't as bad, and I don't know if you have a sense of that from what you hear from people.
Well, my default position is it's always worse than you think it is. So I certainly don't want to say anything that's going to comfort you on all of this. But you're right. I do think that there's a certain amount of performative response to that about the election. However, this has real world consequences because Republican officials, politicians, and leaders are pandering to the true believers or what they think is the true believers, right? If you want to survive in the Republican Party and you're running for governor or secretary of state or state legislature, you have to go along with this big lie, and that has consequences. And of course, it's underlining a lot of the legislation that's going on in the at the state level. So there's kind of a vortex in which the craziest, most irresponsible people are drawing in people who ought to know better. I don't know that 70% actually believe the election are stolen, but they're acting as if it is, and they're pretending that it is. And so I kind of in the back of my mind have this, we've seen what's happened to the political mind of Republicans after 4 years of Donald Trump. What happens with another 3 or 4 years of marinating in believing these lies and conspiracy theories? I mean, that has an effect on a political culture. That has an effect on people's minds. So if you act crazy long enough, do you become crazy, or do you lose the distinction?
All right. So
that's some dark shit, Charlie.
I can get dark with you on this stuff.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Alice Lee has a number of questions in there, but I am going to ask her to focus on her Tulsa question because it is something that Charlie has talked movingly about recently, and it is also a matter on which I have my own personal story that I have been meaning to tell Charlie for a number of days in light of his comments on the subject. So Alice, why don't you focus on that?
Yeah, that was the question I was going to actually end up asking, so that works out. So for the record, I think I only learned about it when watching the Watchmen series for the first time also.
Me too.
Yeah. And I guess I was interested in if you feel like you can kind of cast your mind back to if you had learned about that in, say, like 2006 or something, whether it would be something that you wanted to talk about on your radio show or if it would just be sort of something that was quietly interesting. How do you think, like, in that specific that specific fact is like, how does that fit into your worldview then versus now?
Yeah, I don't know. I honestly don't know the answer to your question about what was going on, what I was thinking in 2006.
Or choose another date.
I will. Okay, well, part of the shock of this to me is that I have said this, that I think I have a pretty good understanding of American history. And now, and so I'm sitting and having the same experience you did. I'm watching the show on HBO and going, okay, I need to put this on pause and go to Wikipedia because that's how I learn everything. And then you realize, okay, this actually happened and I did not know about it, which of course raises the question, what else did I not know about? Which then leads to the larger question of, what does this say about the narrative that you've adapted about American history and the direction of America? So, and this goes to, I'm sorry, Kate, go come back to it, where you start to rethink things. And I guess the whole Trump era is such a shock to the system that if you don't rethink your alliances and your assumptions, then I don't think you've been paying attention. We're involved in kind of a low level, pissing match with this billionaire supporter of some conservative causes who says everybody at the Dispatch are a bunch of whores and liars because they are changing their position on certain conservative issues. And going, well, okay, there's an alternative to the whores and liars, which is that when circumstances change and you learn things you did not know before, and you had a political shock like the Trump era, how do you not rethink these issues? And so this is one of them, because I think that the story that we have told ourselves about the American experiment is, it's been a lot of feel good for a lot of conservatives. And I will say this, though, on the right, the belief that America is good and great and exceptional is so deeply ingrained. So there's not going to be any give on this question of how we teach American history. And unfortunately, what you're having right now is at the moment when we really ought to have a reckoning about American history and about our, racial path, the right is now totally invested into saying that the real threat is wokeness. The real threat is 1619. The real threat is critical race theory. Now, I would love to have a debate about those things, but the reality is that right now, the Republican Party and the right has completely shut themselves off from going, okay, maybe there are some things that we didn't know that we got wrong about race that we need to confront now. I'm sorry, I want to hear Benjamin's story.
Yeah, so I want to tell the story of how I learned about the Tulsa race, what is properly now being called the Tulsa Massacre, but has traditionally been called the Tulsa Race Riot. And I did not learn about it from the Watchmen. I learned about it in 2000, in this period between the election of George W. Bush and 9/11, when I had all this time to think about things because the Clinton impeachment was over and the post 9/11 world hadn't started yet. The Tulsa, an investigative commission had been set up in Tulsa to look at it. study this history, and this is the commission that has since revealed much of what we now know about the riot. There was a pretty extensive New York Times article about how this commission had come to be, and I had never heard of the riot before. And what caught my eye in this article, I was a young editorial writer at the Washington Post, and was that the entire thing had been triggered by an editorial. It was an editorial in the Tulsa Tribune, which was the main daily newspaper. And pardon me for the language I'm about to use. The title of the editorial was "To Lynch a Negro Tonight." And it was a call for a lynching for a guy named, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name. His name was Dick Rowland. And he had been, the story is awful, as these lynching stories generally are, but a crowd showed up at the courthouse to get him, which they did, and they proceeded then, in response to a quite righteous response from members of the Black community in Tulsa, to launch what became this massacre. And here's what really caught my eye about it, and the thing that I have never managed to actually, I'd not forget, because I wouldn't want to forget, but I've never managed to swallow shock about. The editorial has been removed from history. So at the time that I wrote this editorial, and I wrote it because I was an editorial writer, and there was this was somebody who had my job, albeit at a different paper in a different time, had literally gotten 300 people killed with an editorial. And I was, in a mortified and horrified way, kind of fascinated by that. And so I tried to track down the editorial. The New York Times article had said it had been erased, basically. And I went to try to figure out how erased it was. And here's the answer. In the microfilm of the Tulsa Tribune's archive, it is literally cut out with an X-Acto knife. There is not a surviving copy of it left, because a group of people didn't want the story of how this happened to become public. And so that stuff in The Watchmen about erasing history, it is not overstating it at all. It's understating it. The reason people like you, Charlie, didn't know about this until recently is because there has been a deliberate effort to bury it and make it go away, which is exactly what's happening to January 6th. And, this editorial, this happened in 1921. By the 1940s, a graduate student in history, again, I'm forgetting I used to know this stuff really well. Yes, his name was Loren Gill. And this is in the 40s. By that time, it was gone. I believe, this is now years later, and I'm shaky on this. When I wrote this editorial in 2000, I talked to the historians who were involved in the universe of people who were researching this history was tiny at the time. It's much larger now. And basically they told me they had all looked up and down for this editorial and nobody had been able to find it. Loren Gill had been unable to find it. The author of the one book about the Tulsa race riot at the time, there have been many others since, thank God, had been unable to find it. And I went and, I didn't do an exhaustive look for it myself by any means, but I poked around and there was nothing to be found, honestly. I believe the commission finally found a copy. And the work that has been done in Tulsa in the historiography department is unbelievably good. But I think the question that somebody posed in the chat, which is we should ask ourselves, why don't we know this story, is exactly the right one. And the reason is that it has been literally exacto-knifed out of the historiography, out of the available material, because people didn't want the story to be known. And I think, quite apart from the fact that the proper word, by the way, for the Tulsa race riot or massacre is pogrom. That's actually the technically accurate word to describe it. And the idea that we had, a pogrom in 20th century America, and we wrote it out of history, is an amazing fact that we just, need to grapple with.
Yeah, I mean,
and I just want to say that Charlie's dogs are barking in affirmation. They are not trying to blot me out here.
Yeah, I actually had heard about this when I was when I did To Kill a Mockingbird in English class. So,
interesting. So, what year would that have been?
That was 2000, I think, in high school. And so, and I remember specifically my teacher mentioning it and bringing it up and being and saying it in this exact context of and he was a kind of a radical, and he was like, you won't have heard about this, but I want to propose a way to get at the section of the Republican Party that Charlie talks about, and which I'm very familiar with, because they are my people. It is the people I grew up around, and my neighbors and my parents' friends and everything else, that believe that America has a real insight to doing things right, despite these types of moments, like in Tulsa. And I want to say that there needs to be a new appeal to not resting on the laurels of history, but to creating new and better history with those types of individuals. And I think that if you frame, not that everything is about framing or marketing it or whatever, but I do think that if you frame this in a way of you have a choice, you have a choice to turn a blind eye to grave injustice once it's revealed to you and you learn of it, that it happened at some point, or you have a choice to yes, learn anew, and let the fact that you can learn anew and that we have the freedom in this country to learn anew and talk about these things, and that there's the freedom of speech to talk about these things. There is an academic freedom to talk about these things, that all of these things are there and allow us the grace to recover from something so atrocious and come back from it, is a much more powerful way to approach this type of thing than let's shove it back under the bed where no one can ever talk about it ever again and act like it didn't happen.
No, I agree with that. And it's self-evident. Look, we understand the need for other countries and other societies to come to grips with their past and the terrible things that have happened. I mean, we just, we're talking about the Armenian genocide that took place a century ago, because it's important to remember that, because you can't get redemption until you have recognition. Part of the problem, again, I'm sorry to keep using the polarization, though, you say that we should have this discussion, and I think that there's a fear that, despite all, let's have a conversation about race, that's the last thing on earth we actually really want, because if you say the wrong thing, bad things are going to happen. I see the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association is having to quit because somebody questioned whether or not we should be talking about race. So there's some things you can't say. The 1619 Project, I think, is an interesting intellectual effort. But the problem is, once you say that the real founding of the country is 1619, or blanket statements that everything about America is racist, it tends to shut people down. And unfortunately, I think that's where we're at right now, where we have the illiberalism on the right and the left that has made this conversation difficult. Could I just mention one thing in terms of confronting all of this? as I said before, on the right, they are absolutely convinced now that critical race theory and wokeness are the greatest threat to America that we face right now. If you have a chance, read this letter that Russell Moore wrote in leaving the Baptist organization. You know what I'm talking about? Russell Moore
I saw David French's excerpt from it.
Well, that's exactly where I come from on this. Russell Moore is a conservative evangelical who has pushed back against Trumpism and really challenged, his fellow Christians to deal with the issues of race. And he has this letter that has now become public, where he's describing the depth and the virulence of the racism within the church. And I think David French made the point, read this and tell me that anti-racism is the real danger. But you can't confront the virulent racism in the church and this tradition and the way it still plays out. You can't confront that if you're, kind of locked into this, into the mode that we're in, the denial mode. But it's a very, very powerful moment. And I want to go back to the question, which I didn't answer, about if I had known this back in 2006. I wish I'd known this a lot before that. I actually did a cover story in a magazine back in 1982 about racism in the Milwaukee Police Department. Yeah. The legacy of racism, how bad it was. I had been writing about this for decades. But I think at a certain point, we had become somewhat complacent, well, that was bad then, but we have solved most of those problems, and can we now move on? And I think that that's been the problem. And I think Mitch McConnell even gave something, a speech. He said, okay, yes, we used to have slavery in the 1600s, but we had the Civil War, and then we passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So done. It's fixed. Well, it's obviously not fixed. And I think that that's the denial on the right. And I guess part of the tragedy is I come from a kind of a branch of the conservative movement that was prepared to wrestle with this. The Jack Kemps of the world, pre-Trump, even Paul Ryan was trying to wrestle with this question of how do we deal with poverty? How do we deal with race? How do we talk about race in a different way? And all of that is gone now. All of that is gone, and I think it's tragic.
And so let's conclude on that note. When you look back let's focus on Paul Ryan, who's a fellow Wisconsinite who you've known for a long time. And, you are still capable of giving him credit for trying to have a different vocabulary of this sort of thing. And yet you respond must be when I say, let's focus on him.
Yeah. Right.
How do you understand who he is? Is he somebody who you and he were had much in common intellectually, and then the roads forked? Or is he somebody who simply was not sincere about the things that you were sincere about?
I think he was probably sincere at one time, but I think of him as this massive disappointment. I mean, he is the best lack all conviction part of that the quote of the poem from Yeats that I always think about. The worst are filled with passion and intensity, the best lack all conviction. And so he to me embodies this lost opportunity of a Republican Party that could have gone in a different direction, and yet under fire. He stood down and disappeared. My last communication with him was when I wrote an open letter to him in Politico saying, Paul, I know that you're watching what's going on here and, looking for, maybe thinking about doing something about it. Maybe this would be the time to do it. You're on the Fox board. If you want to make a difference, this would be the time to speak out. The red lines have been crossed. If not now, when? Because, your legacy is not necessarily finished unless you decide to make it finish. And Paul just will not push back against this. And this is part of the disease, that you have the worst elements of the right that are dominant and dominating the conversation. And the people who could have been thought leaders on the other side have either been driven out, excommunicated, or have decided to pocket Rupert Murdoch's money as a member of the Fox board. And, I don't know that rises to tragic. but it's pathetic and it's profoundly disappointing, because this is how the Republican Party loses its mind and loses its soul. It's not. I mean, think about what Paul Ryan was. Paul Ryan was the policy wonk. Who gives a shit about policy anymore in the Republican Party? Who's going to talk about, how you make this party, something different? So, okay, you asked about the sincerity. I've said this before. I probably had him on my radio show 100 times talking about the deficit and how terrible this was and how we needed to get a handle on the debt. And then, of course, presiding over the explosion of the deficit. No Republican cares about deficit spending anymore unless it's by Democrats. So I do wonder about the sincerity now. I do think it's legitimate to ask whether or not they ever really cared about debts and deficits. And I have to admit that I heard all the people who said it's all phony, it's all fake. Look, Reagan doesn't care about it. Didn't Dick Cheney said nobody cares about it? And yet in Wisconsin, we had people who pretended to care about it a lot. And, well, maybe it was all bullshit.
We are going to leave it there. It's the first time we've ever left it on the word bullshit. Charlie Sykes, you're a great American, a great Wisconsinite. And the next time I come back from Minnesota to Washington by train, I'm going to stop in Milwaukee to have a drink with you.
We have a stop.
I'm sorry?
We have a stop here, yes.
Yeah, no.
The train stops in Milwaukee. It does.
I know. I'm going to get off at it this time. We will be back tomorrow. Kate, who's our guest tomorrow?
Our guest tomorrow is Nabia Saeed, who is one of my very best friends and is... Oh, hi, Andrew.
Yeah, Andrew,
sorry.
For some reason, just popped up. We missed his question this week. We'll get it next time.
Sorry, Andrew. Our guest tomorrow is Nabia Saeed, who is the president of the Markup, which is of course the data journalism organization that Julia Angwin founded, and she's going to be coming on. She is formerly a deputy general counsel at BuzzFeed and famously deposed and fought for the after the lawsuit around the Trump P-tapes, as they were. And so she's going to, I don't know if she can share those stories because of privilege or what she's going to talk about, but she's going to talk about media freedom and First Amendment. And she will be on 22 hours and 52 minutes from now. And until then, we are not allowed to have fun anymore. But we don't have any more of Donald Trump's blog, which has been shut down blissfully.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he shut it down himself because no one freaking read it. So it was kind of sad.
Traffic was off.
Yeah, so traffic was off. Maybe Tim Wu is right, and there is something to network effects. So we will see you tomorrow. Thanks, Charlie.
Bye, Charlie.